Here's a situation you found yourself in, I promise. Somebody said something you didn't understand, or maybe you told an in-joke that somebody else didn't understand. Somebody had an accent that was unfamiliar to you, or someone misunderstood something that you said as being some other word. A lot of the time, we think of language as being the thing that we use to communicate ideas to other people. I tell you thing A, you understand. You tell me thing B, I understand. Language use, done, right? Wrong. Language does so much more than that. Language itself is all about belonging. What communities are we a part of? How do we show that we're a part of them? My name is Jessi Grieser. I'm an associate professor of English linguistics at the University of Tennessee. I'm also the author of a book coming out next February, The Black Side of the River: Race, Language, and Belonging in Washington, D.C. And today I want to talk to you about that last word, belonging. How does our language let us belong? There are a bunch of ways that belonging matters to how we use language. For starters, community is how we get language to begin with. And language is how we do community, how we show what kinds of groups we're a part of. We also use language to show who belongs as part of our group and who doesn't. And as we use language to indicate how we're a part of community or not, we end up changing the language in ways that are permanent and that get picked up by other people, sometimes people who aren't part of our group. And that means that we have to be aware of what kinds of groups are setting themselves apart with language and why some of those groups are valued more than others. See, language at its core is about who we are and how we signal where we belong. When you think about a language community, you might think, okay, all the people who speak the same language. And you're exactly right. That's one very big language community. And it's really clear that that's a language community. If I show up in Turkey on a layover, which I have, I'm pretty much done for. I don't speak that language or any language like it. I can't do much more than say hi at the airport, and I can only do that if somebody teaches me when I get off the plane. I'm definitely not a part of the Turkish community. So that's a huge language group to which I don't belong. And belonging happens at that big, language-wide level. People use language to make distinctions at those huge levels, but they also do it at smaller and smaller and smaller levels. Sometimes levels that are only a few people or a few hundred people at a time. What do I mean? Well, here's one of my communities. I was in the athletic bands, mostly the marching band, at the University of Michigan, where I got my undergrad degree. Go Blue. And if you were in the athletic bands, you got exposed to all the cheers, not only for football, but for basketball and hockey as well. Now, our hockey cheers at Michigan, well, they're not always very nice, I'll admit it. We're pretty mean to the other team, or at least we try to be. And one way we do that is with a cheer where we point at our goalie and yell, "Goalie!" And then we point at the other team's goalie and yell, "Sieve!" Yeah, sieve. Like the thing you pat flour through when you're baking. Get it? It's full of holes. Everything goes through it, like the other team's goalie lets the puck go through. But here's the part that makes this a language community. People who are in the marching band, even if they weren't in the hockey band, start to use sieve to mean everything falls through you. Lost your dorm key? You're a sieve. Forgot you were supposed to turn in your homework? You're a sieve. But it only works inside that one community. If I turn to someone at work and go, "Oh no, I locked my keys in my office. I'm such a sieve," they think of the baking tool and they don't understand why I'm using that word. But if I say that to my Michigan band friends, even 20 years later, they know exactly what I mean. Language helps us create community, even if it's a small community like 400 members of a marching band. And it's also how we do the communities we're a part of. When I call myself a sieve, I'm connecting myself to all the other people in the band. Not just the people who were in school with me, but even the people who are in the band now. Sometimes it's a much bigger group that we want to signal our belonging to. I'm a Northerner. I'm from the Midwest states of Ohio and Michigan. But 6 years ago, I moved to the South for work. There are a lot of differences between Northern and Southern English, and a lot of similarities too. I want to sound like I belong, but I also don't want to sound fake. And so the thing I picked up, well, it's something that belongs to another community I'm a part of, the African American community. Many African Americans in the US use African American language features at least some of the time. It's a pattern grammar and sound system that's unique to the US African American community. And because the US African American community has its roots in the enslavement of Africans in the South, there's a lot of overlap between that and Southern English. And one of those is the word y'all. I didn't grow up saying y'all because I'm from the North and most of my groups that I hung out with were white people. But when I moved to the South, well, it slid into my vocabulary with quickness because I can use it to connect myself to being Black, and it also helps me seem just a little bit Southern. Language is something we do to show that we're connected to other people. And it's also how we show who doesn't get to be part of our group. You might recognize the girls in this picture. They're from the movie Mean Girls. On Wednesdays, they wear pink, and they say that things are so fetch. And they also spend a lot of time policing who gets to be in their group and who doesn't. I studied a group of women on the internet that I named the Mean Girls because they used the Mean Girls to represent their group. They were actually a bunch of fan fiction readers, and their goal was to, well, be mean. The language practice in the group was to make fun of the stories that other people were reading. It wasn't any particular wording or any particular sound. I mean, it was online, there was no sound. But the way you showed you were a part was by what you said. And it turns out that if you weren't sufficiently making fun of a story that everyone else was making fun of, or heaven forbid you said you liked it, well, the members of the group would slowly start to mock you until you didn't want to be part of the group anymore. Just like the Mean Girls from the movie, the internet Mean Girls had a burn book, and the way you stayed out of it was to participate in their language practice. But that's online and this is real life, right? Well, except for the part where you're online right now watching me, where do we draw the line? But okay, let's talk about people who aren't typing out their thoughts. These are people from another community, the community of Anacostia in Washington, D.C. They all go to the same important church in that neighborhood. It's an almost all Black neighborhood, and when people in that neighborhood use language together, they use it to signal that they're a part of that group. Sometimes that looks like talking about us versus them in a way that makes us all the Black people in DC, and sometimes all Black people, period, and them everybody else. Sometimes that looks like anticipating that someone else is going to think that their neighborhood is ugly. And so instead, talking first about how it's rural and how it's pretty. And sometimes that looks like strategic use of that variety I talked about before, African American language. Like when one of my interviewees complained about a new streetcar by telling me, "They done had them trolley tracks laid down for 2 years. I haven't seen no trolley car run yet." That "done had" and that "haven't seen no trolley car," those were ways at the sentence level she was able to authenticate that she was a Black person using Black language in a Black neighborhood. She belongs, and the people building the trolley car, well, they don't. We use language to belong to the groups that we're a part of at every single level of language. It's in the words we use, it's in the way our accents sound, or the grammar of the dialect we speak. It's in the entire languages we pick for one situation over another. And while we're all out here as speakers trying to belong, well, all that belonging, it's changing the language. Here's an example of how we're changing the language. You might have heard that, accents are getting less. We're all watching TV, and so we're all going to end up sounding alike. Well, turns out people are people, and we like to belong. One place that people belong is in the northern cities. The cities like Detroit, Michigan, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York, and Madison, Wisconsin. And there's a sound change happening up there. It makes a word like desk sound like dusk, and a word like bag sound like biag. Now, I didn't always have this vowel shift. I grew up at the bottom of Ohio. But like I said before, I went to the University of Michigan, and I love that I went there. And I love that I lived there. And somehow when I lived there and I wanted to show that I loved being from Michigan, well, I started saying biag. And I didn't even notice until I moved away and had a part-time job as a cashier, and people didn't know what I was asking them about. Do you need a biag? This is a belonging you might not even notice if you're from this area. But it's happening. And as people try to belong, their vowels and their language come with them. Pretty cool, huh? Here's another person who's had a sound shift. In African American language, one of the things that the grammar absolutely permits is not pronouncing the t or the d sound at the end of a word. So something like west side gets to be west side. And this is pretty unremarkable. Linguists see it, but the people who use it might just think, it's cool, or it's urban, or it's Black. But not every Black person wants to sound that way, or at least not all the time. What I've found is that a lot of middle-class Black people have been taught a lot of messages about how they should sound. Things like enunciate or pronounce your endings. A lot of people I've interviewed have even said that at Howard University, which is a historically Black university in Washington, D.C., they taught diction classes until recently. More on why that matters later. But what that leads to? Well, part of being middle-class Black is really pronouncing your endings, sometimes so far that it's actually different than the ending that was there. Maybe saying something like, I went to bed instead of I went to bed. And as more people do this, the more hanging on to those endings becomes part of sounding like you belong to the Black middle and upper class. Now, I haven't studied exactly how much Michelle Obama specifically does this, but when I bought her audiobook a couple years ago, I couldn't listen to it. I love her voice, but I kept unconsciously trying to study it. I just read the paper version instead. My point, though, is that she belongs, and you can hear it in her voice. And it's not always about sound either. If you're a proficient internet user, you might know that these days you can express that you're excited or upset or overwhelmed by slamming your hands on the keyboard in joy. But it can't just be any old slam. This top one, well, this is your cat walking across the keyboard, or if you have a baby, maybe it's your baby. The keys got smashed, but this isn't a key smash. This one, though, this one is acceptable. This one means I'm excited and not my cat just showed up. As you see other people doing this, you can start to learn that number 2 is right, and you can start to produce key smashes of your own. That's language change happening because we're trying to belong. Or you might recognize this one. Well, if you're any older than I am, you probably don't recognize this one. This means something like please, or that makes me feel all the feels. Someone puts something online that makes your heart melt, and if you know what you're doing, well, you'll respond with this. It's like the marching band. If you're part of some communities online, you know when and how to use this. But if you're new here, well, you might not. We use all kinds of language to show that we belong. It's at the biggest levels of choosing, do you speak English or Spanish? Do you use African American language or Midwestern white English? Do you have a tuh or a duh at the end of your words or not? Or do you instead have a really, really strong one? Do you make a grammatical key smash? Do you use the right emoji? It's this lovely thing where we get to just use our language to belong to the groups we want to belong to, right? Well, not all belongings are the same. We're people, and people do language, and we also do status. And some groups are given higher status by themselves or by their positions of authority or by really negative processes like racism and sexism. And a lot of the time, we don't notice. We just see a group who has a lot of status, and we see the language that they use to belong. And we think, that's the language of status, and I'm going to use that language to belong. A lot of the time, we obscure that the status language is the language of one kind of group by calling it the standard language or the academic language. By now, though, you're probably thinking, but everyone has their own language practices for the groups they belong to. And you're right. We call it standard. But just like everything else, it's the language practices of a specific group, and we have to look very carefully at who those people are. When we think of how to belong to a high status group with language, we have to ask ourselves, well, who gets to be a part of that group? If it's what teachers and professors sound like, or what rich business people sound like, well, who historically has been able to become a teacher or a professor? What groups have historically been able to have the money to become a rich business person? What races were they? What genders were they? Because when you exclude people from a group, you exclude their language as well. So the standard never gets to have other kinds of language in it, and when we finally let other people into the group, we expect that they're the ones who are going to change. Here's one final thing to think about. What happens when the language one group uses to belong gets used by people who don't belong? These words might look familiar to you, especially if you're a late millennial or a Gen Z. And they also might look familiar to you, well, if you're Black. All of these are part of African American language. Now, I started out by talking about how your language can let you belong in 2 groups at once. When I use y'all, I get to call on being a Black woman, but I also get to invoke a little bit of Southern, however inauthentically. So yes, it's true. These words do internet or young right now. They might show that you belong, that you're cool, you know how to use TikTok. I don't know how to use TikTok. But remember just before when we talked about how some groups get to have higher status and that when they do that, they exclude other people and their language? When there's a status differential and someone uses this language without being aware that it's the language of a group that didn't usually get high status and who might catch a lot of flack for the language that they use because they historically didn't have that high status, well, then these high status speakers are using this other language to signal belonging without having to take any of the effects of actually belonging. Now, I'm not going to dictate what you can and can't do, and language practice is always going to have multiple meanings. Being aware of those meanings, though, that's the right place to start. Because when we do, we can stop looking at one group as good and another group as bad. We can start to see the glorious mess that is all of us trying to use language to be people with one another. We can recognize the cool ways that language changes because of what we do as we're in community together. And we can open the language door so that more people belong. I hope that gives you a lot to think about. And if you'd like to think about it in my vicinity, you can find me on Twitter @JessGrieser or on the web at jessgrieser.com. And I hope you have a great time belonging with everyone else here at Duocon. Thank you.